Hello everybody, this is Richard the Dick Coughlin. The length of this video might shock some of you, don't worry, it's not me. In my opinion, Potholer54 is the man on YouTube. He's the best by a country fucking mile. Now, he's done a series of videos responding to a guy called Christopher Monckton, and I have decided to put all of the videos he put together and make them into one big video, just to sort of help promote the point that he's making, and for another reason. I have a personal reason in this. You see, Christopher Monckton is the scientific spokesman for a political party in the United Kingdom called UKIP, who I have particular disdain for, and whom I have absolute contempt and disgust for. And one of the reasons is because they have this guy as their science advisor. Now, his global warming stuff is not the worst of his opinions, but it's pretty fucking bad considering. And UKIP's attitude to science in general is pretty bad. So I wanted to put these together and thank Potholer for making them. This is Richard the Dick Coughlin, 000. Good night and enjoy the show.
I've got a question for all those who are so unskeptical they believe whatever Christopher Monckton says about climate. Why? What is it about him that makes him so believable? Is it his science background as science advisor to Margaret Thatcher?
Or Lord Christopher Monckton, former science advisor to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher?
Is it the fact that he wrote several peer-reviewed scientific papers, so he must know what he's talking about?
Now, when I write a peer-reviewed paper in a scientific journal...
Or is it simply the weight of his irrefutable arguments, which you've checked for yourselves, and show quite clearly that his fellow scientists have got things wrong? Well, we can dispense with the first two very quickly. The idea that Monckton has some kind of a science background may have started with an article he wrote in 2006, claiming to have advised Margaret Thatcher on scientific scams and scares. In fact, he has no science background. He has a degree in classics and a diploma in journalism. And if he was Margaret Thatcher's science advisor, let's check her autobiography to see what she thought of his advice. That's funny. Margaret Thatcher says her science advisor in the policy unit was George Guy's. Well, maybe Monckton was the man who advised her specifically on climate change. After all, he says so himself.
Now, Margaret Thatcher, whom I used to advise on this question 25 years ago...
No, Margaret Thatcher disagrees. She specifically says George Guy's advised her on climate change, as a result of which she made a speech about it to the Royal Society and set up the Climatic Research Unit. So what role did Monckton play in her life? Well, let's take a look in the index. Molotov, Molyneux, monetarism? In the entire 900-page autobiography, it seems Margaret Thatcher couldn't find room for a single mention of one of her most important advisers. To be fair to Monckton, he started out in his climate campaign freely admitting he has no qualifications as a scientist.
So you may be thinking, what right does a non-scientist, albeit a former political advisor to prime ministers, have to talk to us about the science of climate change?
What about that peer-reviewed scientific paper? No, Monckton never wrote one. He was invited to submit an opinion piece to the newsletter of the American Physical Society as part of a debate. This isn't one of the APS's peer-reviewed journals. It's a forum for opinions, as the editorial statement of purpose shows. Monckton's insistence that his piece was peer-reviewed even led the editor to publish a response, pointing out that it wasn't. By now, I'm sure a lot of Monckton fans will be saying, what does it matter if he isn't a scientist? He was never Margaret Thatcher's science advisor and has never published a scientific paper. If he's not presenting his own theories, but just correctly presenting data and inferences from the scientific literature, he doesn't need a science background. And I agree. But all this is conditional on these facts and these quotes being correct. If anyone thinks we should unquestioningly believe whatever Monckton says, and that checking his facts is somehow unfair, I'm going to call on someone who's going to support me throughout these videos.
Scepticism is the highest of duties, blind faith, the one unpardonable sin.
Yes, Christopher Monckton himself.
Now, I'm not going to give you, as he did in that film, my opinion about climate change, because it is as worthless as his. Everything I say, I can and will, on request, verify, either in the data or with equations or in the peer-reviewed literature.
Then that makes things very easy. Where Mr. Monckton gives sources, we can check them to make sure he's quoting them correctly. Where he doesn't give sources, we'll find out if he has any. Because as we'll see later in this video, I wrote to Mr. Monckton asking him to verify certain facts and asking for his sources, but the results were quite extraordinary, because I discovered that the person who can best debunk Christopher Monckton is Christopher Monckton himself. So where do we start?
So here's the first one. We've had 9 years of a global cooling trend since the 1st of January 2001. There has been global cooling for the last 8 or 9 years.
Well, if Monckton is quoting from the data and the scientific literature, what does the data and the scientific literature say about this? A paper published in 2008 by the National Climate Centre in Australia looked at temperature data from the world's 3 terrestrial temperature monitoring bodies and concluded, in all 3 data sets, the linear trend over 1998 to 2007 is upward, i.e. one of warming, even if the warming is weaker in the British data set than in the American data sets. 1998 was even warmer than Monckton's starting point, 2001. In addition, an independent group of statisticians was given the raw data by the Associated Press without being told what it was. The experts found no true temperature declines over time. And the AP quoted NOAA climate monitoring chief Decky Arndt as saying, "The last 10 years are the warmest 10-year period of the modern record. Even if you analyse the trend during that 10 years, the trend is actually positive, which means warming." So if temperature monitoring bodies and reviewers and statisticians say the trend is up, what experts is Monckton citing to show the trend is down?
And what that looks to me like is a fairly hefty, and indeed it is, statistically significant rate of fall.
It turns out, none. Monckton is giving us his own opinion, and since he has no expertise in this field, he's quite right to say that his opinion is as worthless as Al Gore's. For a start, you can't tell statistical significance just by looking at a graph. As I explained in an earlier video, statistically significant doesn't mean notable. It has a specific mathematical meaning and has to be calculated. But statistically significant or not, how did Monckton end up drawing a downward trend line when all the experts insist that the trend is up? It turns out the answer is very simple. It all depends on where you choose your start and end points. Global temperatures are subject to short-term cyclical factors, from the El Niño southern oscillation every few years to the solar cycle every 11 years. So if you choose the start and end point over a very short period of time, with strong warming factors such as El Niño near the start and an exceptional solar minimum towards the end, these natural background fluctuations will skew the result. John Grego, a professor of statistics at the University of South Carolina, told the AP, "If you look at the data and sort of cherry-pick a micro trend within a bigger trend, that technique is particularly suspect." If Monckton fans find that hard to believe, I have someone here who'll tell you exactly the same thing.
If you choose your start points and your end points carefully enough, you can make it look as though any trend you want is happening. We've had 9 years of a global cooling trend since the 1st of January 2001.
So how do climate scientists and statisticians get around this problem? As I explained in Climate Change, Is the Earth Cooling? For one thing, they look at time periods over decades rather than just a few years. When you expand the timeline and look at the last few years in context, things look a little different. They can also correct this data for anomalies like the El Niño southern oscillation. But most commonly, they even out the background fluctuations by taking a moving average every 5, 10 or 11 years. That way, the underlying trend becomes clear. Temperatures started moving upwards in the mid to late 1970s, and they're still moving up today.
So then we go on to Arctic sea ice, which follows a regular kind of sine wave. It comes and goes with the seasons. There's lots of it during the winter, not so much during the summer. Nothing particularly to worry about in that graph there. In fact, there was a temporary loss of Arctic sea ice at the summer minimum in 2007. That's the left-hand globe there. But then by 2008, it's the purple area, which is the sea ice. That's just the way the computer graphics from the satellite do it. By 2008, half of that missing ice had come back. By 2009, nearly all of it had come back. So we're not looking at a sort of long-term systematic loss of ice in the Arctic.
Now this surprised me because research papers show there's been a steady loss of Arctic sea ice for 30 years. Since Monckton says everything he tells us comes from the data and the scientific literature, then it should be easy to discover who's right. All I needed was Monckton's source. As so often happens, Monckton doesn't give a source, so I wrote to him asking for one, and he wrote back, "For Arctic and Antarctic sea ice, see the monthly CO2 reports that I produce for the Science and Public Policy Institute. The graphs are all explained and sourced." There was only one graph that specifically related to Arctic ice, going back just 10 years, and while the graph was sourced, the interpretation of it was not. So I asked Monckton again for the sources that back up his claim that we're not looking at a sort of long-term systematic loss of ice in the Arctic. He came back with this. Arctic sea ice has indeed been declining in extent for 30 years, and the monthly CO2 reports fairly reflect this. What was that first bit again? Arctic sea ice has indeed been declining in extent for 30 years. But didn't you just tell everyone...
We're not looking at a sort of long-term systematic loss of ice in the Arctic.
Once again, which Monckton should we believe? Writing in the monthly CO2 report, Monckton does indeed accept that there has been a decline. There has been a very slight decline in the trend of global sea ice extent over the decades, chiefly attributable to a loss of sea ice in the Arctic during the summer. So his preaching of no long-term decline is not only unsupported by the data and the scientific literature, even Monckton accepts that it's wrong. And yet the arguments he gives to his audiences seem absolutely convincing. So let's see how Monckton managed to persuade them.
If you choose your start points and your end points carefully enough, you can make it look as though any trend you want is happening.
In this case, Monckton's start point and end point were embarrassingly close together. His start point was just 2 years earlier, in 2007, when ice extent was at a record low. This wasn't primarily caused by global warming, it was the result of winds and currents, and Monckton acknowledges this. But there are 30 years of data going back to when satellite images were first taken. This is what it shows. As Monckton admits, when you press for a source, it's a 30-year decline. And if we go back even further, we can see the last 30 years in context. So Monckton seems to be giving one message to his audiences and in videos, but a very different message if anyone takes the trouble to check his facts in more detail. As I've said before, when someone makes a surprising claim, the best way to disprove it is to force them to give up their source, however reluctantly. 90% of the time, finding the source, or the non-existence of a source, gets you to the truth.
How many of you have heard that Greenland is melting away? Yes, that's right, you've all heard that. Right. Here is a paper by Johannessen et al., very diligent Danish researcher, using laser altimetry. And what he found was that between 1992 and 2003, the average thickness of the vast Greenland ice sheet increased by 2 inches a year.
Up to a point, Lord Copper. Once again, resolving the differences between Monckton and the climatologists is fairly easy, because both claim to cite the scientific literature. And here Monckton actually gives us a source, a paper by Johannessen published in 2005. If Johannessen's altimetry measurements show a thickening of the Greenland ice sheet, and this is not disputed by other researchers, then Monckton doesn't need to convince me with pictures of ice getting thicker. What I am going to do is check what Monckton claims. I'm going to read Johannessen's paper. And it turns out he did not report that the average thickness of the Greenland ice sheet has increased. On the contrary, he says we can't make that assessment because his study only measured the interior of Greenland at an altitude of 1,500 meters or more. The title of the paper alone should have been a clue. It's conceivable, Johannessen says, that Greenland is losing more ice through ablation, that's melting, at the lower altitudes than it's gaining ice at the higher altitudes he measured. That's putting what he said into plain English, but if Monckton fans find it hard to believe Monckton got this wrong, please pause the video and read what Johannessen wrote for yourselves, or look up the paper on the internet and read the whole thing. And since that paper was published, other studies have shown that the ice loss at lower altitudes is greater than the ice gain that Johannessen measured. In other words, there's a net loss of ice from Greenland. 2 definitive papers were published in 2006. So these were available to Monckton at the time he made his speeches, telling everyone that there was no net loss. Another thing that Monckton missed is Johannessen's conclusion that the increase in ice at higher altitudes could be due to a decadal climate system like the North Atlantic Oscillation. What's more, he says this increase was predicted by climate models.
I am simply going to tell you a series of facts from the science and the data and the peer-reviewed literature, and I am going to allow you to draw the conclusion for yourselves.
I'm not going to presume that Monckton is deliberately trying to mislead his audiences. As always, I can't discern motivation. I can only check the information and show whether it's right or wrong. But assuming Monckton is sincere in his beliefs, then there are only two possible conclusions. Either he didn't read or he misunderstood the scientific studies that have measured the loss of ice in Greenland, and either he didn't read or he misunderstood the one paper he quoted upon which his entire argument rests. I would urge Monckton fans to do what I did. If he doesn't give a source, be sceptical. If he does give a source, read it.
And that's what the scientific method is about. It's about checking.
Monckton gets so many things wrong, and it's so easy to show that he's wrong, that I've got at least 2 more videos to do on him. And in case they get removed from YouTube, please copy and mirror them.
Let's take Professor Richard Lindzen, for instance, who has produced paper after paper showing that climate sensitivity is around 1/4 to 1/7 of what the UN says. That means 3 watts per square metre, all anthropogenic forcings estimated by the IPCC 0.8, 5 times as much forcing from natural causes.
The question I asked in my first video on Monckton is, why do people believe him? And here we start to get an insight. Here he is on national television in Australia, debating a professional climate scientist and easily getting the better of him. You can tell Dr. Ben McNeill is thinking, shit, I thought this would be a pushover. I wish I'd prepared. Yes, McNeill would have been wise to find out a bit more about Monckton and his arguments before coming on the programme, because Monckton certainly did his homework on McNeill.
With all respect, you are not an expert on the central question in this debate, which is climate sensitivity. How much warming will you get if you add CO2 to the atmosphere?
And he's right. McNeill isn't an expert on climate sensitivity. He's an expert on carbon dioxide absorption in oceans, which is the subject of most of his research. So when Monckton turns to an area outside of McNeill's expertise, Monckton can pretty well make any claim he likes without fear of contradiction. Let's face it, he sounds bold, confident, eloquent, and sure of his assertions. McNeill can't check whether Monckton's claims are correct, neither can the interviewer. But we can, so that's exactly what we're going to do. First, let me explain some terms that you'll hear a lot. Put simply, forcing is the amount of warming caused by whatever might be warming the Earth. It could be the sun, or a greenhouse gas, or a light reflective surface turning into a darker one. The amount of forcing or warming due to a doubling of CO2 levels is pretty much agreed on by all climatologists. Richard Lindzen, the skeptic everyone likes to quote, says this figure is about 3.5 watts per square metre, as noted in the last 3 IPCC scientific assessments. The IPCC actually puts the figure at 3.7 watts per square metre, but there's a margin of error, so we're in the same ballpark. When forcing increases, the average global surface temperature rises until it reaches a stage where the amount of energy leaving the Earth is about the same as the amount of energy being pumped in by the forcing. This is called the equilibrium temperature, and in its most basic form it's very easy to work out. Temperature equals forcing times lambda, which is the Earth's sensitivity. It's usually written as delta T to denote a change in temperature in response to delta F, a change in forcing. So forcing is like a heater in a cabin, and sensitivity tells us the final temperature the cabin will reach in response to that heat. It's important to understand the difference between forcing and sensitivity, because as we'll see in a minute, Monckton gets them completely mixed up. If no other factors are involved, climate sensitivity is about 0.27. So if we plug in a forcing of 3.7 watts per square metre caused by a doubling of CO2, we'd get an increase in temperature of about 1 degree centigrade. This is also generally agreed on by all climate scientists. Unfortunately, other factors are involved. As the Earth warms towards this level, changes happen that tend to amplify and reduce the warming, known as positive and negative feedback. Lindzen argues that more water vapour will produce more clouds, which reflect sunlight and may act as a negative feedback, outweighing all the positives. The reason this isn't generally accepted is because other climatologists have found flaws in Lindzen's hypothesis. For one thing, it only encompasses the tropics, not the whole Earth. And even clouds in the tropics not only reflect sunlight and act as a negative feedback, they also send outgoing long-wave radiation back to Earth, and so act as a positive feedback. And the other reason Linson's hypothesis doesn't fit is that researchers working in a completely different field, geology, found that the feedback effects from CO2 in the past were clearly positive, not negative. So these various feedbacks have to be plugged in to find out what the Earth's sensitivity really is, and therefore what the equilibrium temperature will be. Modelling is just one of many different ways sensitivity can be determined. Glaciologists and geologists determine sensitivity by looking at how global temperatures changed according to carbon dioxide level rises in the past. A review of the various results from a dozen different methods, each denoted by a different colour, shows that nearly all cluster around the 2 to 4.5 degree range. I'll squash them up so we can see them in one frame. The thicker lines show more results and greater probability. Individual results that are well outside the cluster, known as outliers, are marked with crosses. So let's just pick a result at random. This study, for instance, shows that global temperatures will rise by 10 degrees because of a doubling of CO2. And this one, for instance, says the same thing. So we now know that temperatures will rise by 10 degrees, which is 3 times higher than the IPCC estimate. What do you mean that's nonsense? Rats. The Monckton fans have spotted what I did. Yes, I completely ignored the majority of results clustered in the middle and just happened to deliberately pick the most extreme outliers. Then I pretended that they were representative of the body of evidence and claimed that we know these results are correct. You could just as easily pick a couple of studies from the opposite extreme and do the same thing. But who would do something as obviously bogus as that?
Let's take Professor Richard Linson, for instance, who has produced paper after paper showing that climate sensitivity is around 1/4 to 1/7.
So now we're beginning to see Monckton's performance in context. He cherry-picked extremely low figures that are clearly outside the range of most research. Then he conveys the impression that this result is correct, undisputed, known and settled. The biggest problem is that a number of papers have found flaws in the research of Linson, Douglas and Knox, and Monckton makes no mention of this.
And here's my own calculation, and we get 1.6 degrees Celsius as the change in temperature for a doubling of CO2. The warming we would expect to get if we doubled the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, that is what's known as climate sensitivity, will be about 1/5 of a Celsius degree, just a little bit more than 1/5 of a Celsius degree.
In his piece in the Forum on Physics and Society newsletter, Monckton gives yet another figure for temperature rise, 0.58 degrees centigrade. Which one Monckton decides to settle on really doesn't matter, because we'll see that his calculation method is nonsense anyway. He laid it out in the APS newsletter piece. I'm not going to go over the whole thing, because people far better qualified than me have already done that. I'll just point out one of the most egregious errors that even the most scientifically illiterate can grasp. It concerns the figure for forcing, which Monckton initially puts at 3.405 watts per square metre. OK, this is lower than the accepted estimate of 3.5 to 3.7, but never mind, that's small beer compared to what he does next. He divides it by 3. So he now gives us a forcing of just 1.135 watts per square metre. Monckton says this is to take account of the observed failure of the tropical mid-troposphere to warm as projected by the models, citing a paper by Richard Linson. But whether the tropical mid-troposphere warms as projected or not, this isn't forcing, it's sensitivity. Nowhere in the cited paper does Linson cut forcing. In fact, Linson specifically says in the same paper that forcing is 3.5 watts per square metre for a doubling of CO2. Nowhere near Monckton's 1.135. Surely no one who testifies to Congress on the subject of climate could possibly mix up sensitivity and forcing, especially in what he claims is his peer-reviewed paper. That would be like confusing time and distance, or pressure and volume. They're two completely different things. But then our old ally comes along to show that's exactly what he did. In an attempt to hit back at his critics, Monckton justified his decision by citing a passage from Linson's 2007 paper. He made a mistake on the date, by the way, but it's obvious that in the passage Monckton quotes, Linson is talking about sensitivity, not forcing. After reading the critiques of his calculation, Monckton obviously and rather belatedly realized this. But instead of admitting his mistake, Monckton decides to simply substitute one word for another, as if no one will notice. In his rebuttal, he justifies dividing sensitivity by 3. But if we check back with his APS piece, we can see he didn't do any such thing. He divided forcing by 3, and he says so. It even came in a section titled Radiative Forcing Reconsidered. I don't think anyone could show more clearly that Monckton mistook sensitivity for forcing than this attempt at a rebuttal by Monckton himself. So as impressive as Monckton's equations may seem, and as clever as they make Monckton look in front of audiences, they're nonsense. The trouble is, audiences do get dazzled by sums and symbols and can't tell the difference between good physics and crap.
If we apply that equation to this question of whether the clouds building up would make the Earth warmer or cooler, we get an extremely clear answer. It would make it cooler if you had more clouds. I'm not going to go through this calculation now. You'll be glad to hear. Anyone who's nerdy enough to want to follow it, get my slides and read the text underneath.
Please, sir, I'm nerdy enough. First, another quick explanation. Albedo is the reflectivity of a surface. So a black surface will have a very low albedo and a warming effect because it doesn't reflect much radiation. A white or shiny surface will have a very high albedo and a cooling effect. So let's go to the slides. Monckton's hypothesis on this is called bears crap in the woods. Here we demonstrate very easily that increasing the Earth's albedo has a very large cooling effect. Well, yes, that was easy. Since increasing albedo has a cooling effect, Monckton has successfully demonstrated that increasing albedo has a cooling effect, and sitting under a shade has a shading effect. Then Monckton imagines the Earth without an atmosphere, so that an increase in cloud cover is represented by an increase in whiteness on the planet's surface. Again, no arguments about the result. If you paint dark areas of a planet white, you increase the albedo and cool it down. Monckton concludes that therefore, the higher the albedo, the cooler the planet. Well, no, that's different. A cooling effect is not the same as saying that one thing will be cooler than another. The best way to empirically show that this is crap is to apply it to a couple of planets. Venus has a very high albedo of around 0.75, while Mercury is less than 0.1. So according to Monckton, Venus should be much cooler than Mercury. In fact, it's hotter, even though it's much further from the Sun. Why? Because it has an atmosphere. Of course, Monckton eliminated the Earth's atmosphere in order to do his hypothetical calculation, but as we can see from the example of Venus and Mercury, this hypothetical exercise leads to a hypothetical result that doesn't match reality. So let's come back to the real world and put the Earth's atmosphere back. Now, instead of just reflecting solar radiation and cooling the Earth down, the clouds do what they do in the real world. They also stop radiation escaping from Earth and add warming. In his speeches, of course, Monckton doesn't tell his audience that his proof requires the omission of the atmosphere. Well then, is there anyone who can support Monckton on this?
Now, this paper was written in 2005 by a satellite nerd named Pinker. He is wholly unconcerned with the global warming debate. And what he found was this, that there was a significant, naturally occurring decline in cloud cover between 1983 and 2001. So what we know from this is that something like 4/5 of the warming over that period in the satellite era, when we can work out what caused it, was in fact caused by a change in cloud cover.
The radiative forcing, the change in temperature forced by something happening, was naturally occurring cloud cover change of 3 watts per square metre.
Hold that thought while we watch a clip from Annie Hall.
I think that my insights into Mr. McLuhan, well, have a great deal of validity.
Oh, do you?
Yeah.
Well, that's funny because I happen to have Mr. McLuhan right here. So, yeah, just let me come over here a second.
Oh, I heard what you're saying. You know nothing of my work. You mean my whole fallacy is wrong. How you ever got to teach a course in anything is totally amazing.
Boy, if life were only like this.
Well, sometimes life is like that. When Monckton again pontificated on the work of Dr. Pinker at a debate in Australia, his opponent Tim Lambert was ready for him.
So here we have an enormous, naturally occurring forcing, verified in Pinker's paper by 4 separate methods.
Lambert did the next best thing to dragging Pinker on stage. He had a recording of someone reading a statement from her.
The CO2 radiative forcing value that Mr. Christopher Monckton is quoting refers to the impact on the Earth's radiative balance. The numbers that we quote in our paper represent the change in surface shortwave radiation due to changes in the atmosphere, clouds, water vapor, aerosols. These two numbers cannot be compared at their face value. To the best of my understanding, this is the source of the misunderstanding.
This might seem amusing, but several months after hearing Dr. Pinker's words for himself, Monckton was still misrepresenting her paper, this time to members of Congress.
This is Dr. Pinker's paper establishing that the warming of that period was caused largely by a naturally occurring reduction in cloud cover, extra sunlight reaching the ground.
For some reason, they preferred to hear an explanation of Dr. Pinker's work from Monckton rather than Dr. Pinker. So once again, Pinker had to issue a rebuttal, this time to Congress, detailing Monckton's misreading and misunderstanding of her research.
I'm going to testify not, of course, as a scientist, because I'm not one, but as a policymaker. And the role of policymakers, when confronted with scientists, is to know what questions to ask. And I'm going to raise one or two questions now. It relies on a bogus statistical technique. It is defective, as I shall now show. Not very much warming is going to happen. The reality, however, is just 0.7. The IPCC should not have used that first graph. Let us now see what the true position is. The conclusion from this is that we can explain the warming by other methods. So if we move quickly on then to the next slide, here we get a rather prodigious mismatch again between CO2 concentration, which is the black line, and temperature concentration, which is the blue line, going right back to almost 600,000 years into the past. And here we had almost 7,000 parts per million of CO2, compared with 385 or thereby today. 7,000 then. Temperature managed to get up to about 22 Celsius and has never really gone much higher than that at any time over the past half billion years. As best it can be reconstructed. There are, of course, again, difficulties going that far and getting accurate results, but the IPCC itself says that in the Cambrian, carbon dioxide certainly went up, in its opinion, to around 6,000 parts per million, so this is not a controversial graph. What it is controversial is that, again, it doesn't show a terribly good link between the two. And look at how little correlation there is in that graph between temperature in blue there and CO2 concentration in black. Plainly, CO2 is only a bit part player in all this.
What I love about Christopher Monckton is that he doesn't give us fuzzy conclusions based on ambiguities, as do Tim Ball and other critics of climate science. He's like a school student who not only shows his math teacher the answer, but also his workings out to show how he got there. So it's very easy to see exactly where he went wrong. Just check his sums and check his sources. Monckton's sources for no correlation between CO2 and temperature are shown right here. Two researchers, Berner, who compiled a graph showing CO2 levels, and Scotties, who compiled a graph showing temperatures. Put the two together, and you get the graph Monckton used. Scotties hasn't done any analysis of correlation, but Berner has. So let's look at the paper where the data Monckton used was published, which obviously Monckton should have read if he's citing this as his source. We'll read Berner's conclusion together. This means that over the long term there is indeed a correlation between CO2 and paleotemperature as manifested by the atmospheric greenhouse effect. Did Monckton somehow miss this? Dana Royer, who also reviewed all the data on past temperatures and CO2 levels in a landmark paper, also concluded that there's a clear correlation throughout the Phanerozoic. You may find this a bit odd because the graph Monckton showed his audiences obviously shows no correlation at all. So either geologists are in on this global conspiracy with climatologists and are lying through their teeth in order to set up a world Marxist government, or there's something they know that's missing from Monckton's graph. For those who share Monckton's confusion, let me again use the analogy of a heater in a mountain cabin and see if you can work out what that missing something might be. Remember, the warming effect of CO2 is the output of our heater and the cabin is the earth. If there's a correlation, then whenever we turn up the heater, the cabin should warm up. When we turn the heater down, the cabin will cool down. So let's see how they correlate over a 6-month period. If we start our graph on January 1st, the heat is way up high and the temperature of the cabin is toasty and warm. During a cold snap, I turn the heater up a bit, but I still freeze my nuts off. In the spring, I begin to turn the heater down, and so it goes on with the cabin temperature remaining reasonably equitable until we reach today, July 1st. This is a fairly typical output from most home heating systems between January and July. Over time, we can plot the output of the heater and the corresponding temperature, and we can see there's no bloody correlation at all. But how come? The only possible conclusion is that the heater does not affect the temperature of the cabin. When you think about it, it's obvious, because here the heater was turned up much higher than today, and yet the cabin was much cooler. But before you believe someone who tells you this means you can turn up the heater in the middle of summer and it won't make life in the cabin unbearably hot, you might want to find out why the experts disagree. Actually, I hope everyone is smart enough to have figured out why there's no correlation. When I began heating the cabin on January 1st, it was midwinter and solar irradiation was very low. When I finished plotting the graph on July 1st, it was midsummer. What's missing from our graph is the most important heat source of all, the sun. But surely the analogy isn't the same as the Earth, because the sun obviously gives the northern hemisphere more heat between January and July, but it hasn't been getting hotter between the Cambrian and now. Oh, yes, it has. Unless you think solar physicists and cosmologists have also joined the international Marxist conspiracy, the sun was around 6% weaker during the Cambrian, and it's been growing more powerful over time. A useful way of looking at this is to think of the Cambrian as Earth's winter, and today as its summer. When you take solar irradiance into account, Royer showed there's almost a perfect correlation between CO2 and global temperature. A paper published in 2010 called carbon dioxide the principal control knob of the Earth's temperature. Not understanding the implications of the sun's weakness leads Monckton into all sorts of other misconceptions.
750 million years ago, a mile of ice at the equator, ice planet all round, therefore, at the surface, 300,000 parts per million of CO2. Will you tell me how that much CO2 could have been in the atmosphere and yet allowed that amount of ice at the equator?
Well, I'm glad he's phrased this as a question, because it's a good question. It's a shame Monckton never tried to find the answer before hitting the stage and going to Congress with his own theories. If his debating opponent Tim Lambert will allow me, I'll be happy to answer it. The specific time Monckton's referring to is towards the end of what's colloquially known as Snowball Earth. The evidence of an Earth covered in ice is the discovery of glacial dropstones in rocks that were in the tropics over 700 million years ago. Given the weakness of the sun at the time, an ice planet is no surprise. Since this is our geological winter, the sun should have kept our planet permanently frozen, and the high albedo of ice would have kept it that way. The fact that it wasn't permanently frozen, a puzzle once called the faint sun paradox, is explained by the warming effect of greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide. But if carbon dioxide levels fell, or some other event overcame this greenhouse effect, it wouldn't have taken much to tip the world into an ice age. The expanding ice reflected more of the already weak solar irradiation, a positive feedback, leading to more cooling, more ice and more reflection, until nearly the entire planet was covered with ice. Lambert explains quite rightly that the albedo of this ice planet would have been extremely high. Nearly all the solar radiation falling on it, which wasn't very much anyway because of the weaker sun, would have been reflected. There's no way the sun could have melted all this ice, and even Monckton wouldn't suggest such a thing. But something did, because within a few million years the ice had not only disappeared, the Earth had turned into a hothouse. Geologists say the explanation is very simple. The only part of the Earth not covered by ice were warm spots caused by volcanoes. They weren't enough to melt the area around them, let alone an entire planet made of ice, but they did release gases when they erupted, including carbon dioxide. Under normal conditions, this carbon dioxide would have reacted with rocks and rainwater to form carbonate minerals, which get washed out to sea. But in snowball Earth conditions, there's no rain, no chemical weathering, and no disposal of this carbon dioxide. It just kept building up in the atmosphere over millions of years to higher and higher concentrations. until eventually it reached a high enough concentration to overcome the weak sun and the high albedo of ice. So if you were to take a snapshot in time at the end of the last snowball, of course you'd find exceptionally high CO2 levels while glaciers were at the equator. But this is a dynamic process. It doesn't stand still like this. If we go back to the analogy of our winter cabin, let's say we've been away for months and it's covered in ice and frozen solid. The only way to unfreeze it is to put the heater on very high. When it's going full blast, take a picture. Does this tell you the heater obviously has no effect on the temperature of the cabin? I'm sure everyone knows the answer, but for the sake of those who don't, the answer is no. It means it takes a few hours or even days for the heater to do its work and melt all the ice. And if the heater keeps going, then you'll turn the cabin into a sauna. In exactly the same way, it took millions of years for the greenhouse warming from all that CO2 to completely melt the ice. Melting an ice planet takes a lot of heat, and physicists have calculated just how much was needed. It turns out that the level of CO2 in the atmosphere had to be 350 times what it is today. As the ice melted, open areas of ocean absorbed more heat from the sun, setting up positive feedback. So the melting accelerated. After the ice melted, the high levels of CO2 were still around, and the Earth's albedo was much lower, so temperatures kept rising. The Earth now swung the other way into a hothouse. So far from showing that carbon dioxide doesn't have any effect on temperatures, Snowball Earth shows the complete opposite. It confirms what other studies of the Earth's history have shown, that since output from the sun has been steadily rising, carbon dioxide is the key driver of long-term climate change on Earth. If something else unlocked a frozen Earth, and something else turned the Earth into a hothouse during that geological winter, Monckton doesn't explain what he thinks it was.
You're going to like this. I got this from Professor M.I. Bhatt of the Indian Geological Survey when I was asking him what was happening to the Himalayan glaciers. They're doing fine, by the way. He's got 200 years of records from the days of the Raj, when we first began monitoring these things, don't you know. And the glaciers are showing no particular change in 200 years. The only glacier that's declined a little is Gangotri, very famous glacier, because there's been local geological instability, nothing to do with global warming. All the others are doing fine.
We've heard a lot about Himalayan glaciers since the IPCC made that horrendous bungle predicting their disappearance by 2035. Lord Monckton says there's been no sign of change for 200 years, and none of the glaciers are even retreating, except one, and that's because of local geological instability. But once again, Monckton tells his audiences this without citing a source, except for someone called Professor Bhatt. So I wrote to Monckton to get his source. You quote M.I. Bhatt, but could you please cite the specific research paper where he published his study on this, if that is your source? If not, what was your source? I received this reply. Professor Bhatt is entirely clear as the man on the ground that there is no unusual pattern of glacial advance or recession in the Himalayas, and the locally produced literature tends to support this. Monckton attached a paper which didn't support his contention that Himalayan glaciers had been stable for 200 years. So I wrote back, I respect Professor Bhatt's opinion. The problem is I really need references to the published peer-reviewed research that it's based on. Has he or anyone written either a paper showing evidence that supports that opinion? When Monckton replied, he still gave no reference to a paper which substantiated his claim. But I did learn about the status of the mysterious Professor Bhatt. If you would like to learn more about Himalayan glaciers, talk to the guy who is responsible for monitoring them. And then he gave me the email address. It was becoming clear that Monckton had no research to back up his statement that the Himalayan glaciers had been stable for 200 years. Instead, he based all of his assertions on the word of Professor Bhatt, in the belief that he's the person responsible for monitoring Himalayan glaciers. So in order to verify his source, that needs to be substantiated. Back to Monckton again for an explanation. Isn't Professor Bhatt's research field tectonics, not glaciology? In what professional or official capacity is he the guy who is responsible for monitoring Himalayan glaciers? I got back a long discourse on the role of tectonics in glaciers and how the Himalayas are rising, another reference to the fact that the IPCC got it wrong, and puzzlement that I continued to demand references. Actually, I wasn't asking for references, I was asking Monckton to substantiate his claim that his source was the person responsible for monitoring Himalayan glaciers, and nowhere in his long email did he answer that question. But buried right at the bottom was the admission I'd been expecting. Yes, mountain glaciers in many regions, including the Himalayas, have been receding.
The glaciers are showing no particular change in 200 years.
Well, Mr. Monckton, now you know why I continue to ask, very politely by the way, for your sources. In the absence of any, you finally have to acknowledge the facts. When pressed for a source, you eventually say that they've been receding since the 1820s. Even this has no source, but I'm not going to chase up your sources every time you decide to change your mind about what you call the truth. But although I finally had Monckton's confession on the glaciers, I still didn't have an answer to my very simple question about his source. And when politicians evade questions, it means they're hiding something. By now I'd written to Dr. Batt and asked him this very question. Could I describe you as the person who is responsible for monitoring Himalayan glaciers? To which Batt had responded, the big and loud answer is no! So if Batt himself doesn't seem to think he was responsible for monitoring glaciers, I was curious as to what evidence Monckton had that he was. So I asked again. To recap, you said the source of your Himalayan glaciers claim is Dr. Batt, whom you describe as the guy who is responsible for monitoring them. Since this is your claim, I have to establish in what official or professional capacity Dr. Batt is the person responsible for monitoring Himalayan glaciers. This should be a fairly easy question to answer. Did I get an answer? No, of course not. But I did get the familiar Monckton climb down. No admission that what he said was wrong, just a quiet change of wording. Instead of being the guy responsible for monitoring Himalayan earthquakes, Professor Batt suddenly gets demoted to someone who merely seems to be knowledgeable. So with no admission that he got anything wrong, Monckton has now climbed all the way down from a speech where he told audiences that the Himalayas have shown no particular change in 200 years, based on the advice of the person responsible for monitoring them, to a claim that they've been retreating for nearly 200 years, based on the advice of someone who seems to be knowledgeable, and not a single peer-reviewed paper in sight.
Everything I say, I can and will, on request, verify, either in the data or with equations or in the peer-reviewed literature.
It's a favourite tactic of anyone who wants to undermine science. Compile a list of quotes, usually from scientists, and usually taken out of context. Monckton does this, of course, but he also goes a step further. If he doesn't think the quote is convincing enough, he'll simply change it.
One of the ClimateGate conspirators here, talking privately, says there has been no global warming for a decade. We cannot explain why. It is a travesty that we can't.
The first thing to be suspicious of, if someone throws a quote at you, is the lack of a source. And very few Monckton quotes are properly sourced, which of course makes it harder to see whether they're real or imaginary. ClimateGate, for example, isn't a source. A date and an email reference would be a source. But this one is fairly easy to track down, because the East Anglia University emails are all listed on the net, and there's a search engine to locate particular emails. And this is the famous one from Trenberth that Monckton's referring to. The exact quote is, "The fact is that we can't account for the lack of warming at the moment, and it's a travesty that we can't." Now, if this means the same thing, then why change it? Trenberth, of course, was referring to the energy budget. Monckton thinks he should have been saying something more akin to a key Monckton argument about the lack of global warming for a decade, so presto, Monckton changes the quote to make it comply. Of course, it now means something very different. If you want to argue that it doesn't change the meaning at all, and it still means exactly the same thing, then why change it? Why not tell us what Trenberth actually wrote, and let us make up our own minds about the meaning? This is a question I want you to bear in mind as we go through a list of other fabricated quotes. If this was an isolated case, it could be regarded as a sloppy error, but it's part of a pattern of carefully changed and rearranged quotes that pepper Monckton's presentations. Here's another one.
And he said, "The Armageddon scenario that he depicts is not based on any scientific view."
This is supposed to be a quote from Justice Burton, the judge who ruled on the use of Al Gore's film, An Inconvenient Truth, in British schools. I was sceptical of this as soon as I heard it, because I was aware of the court case, and this quote just didn't seem to fit the judge's final ruling. So I checked a transcript of the summing up. No surprise, Monckton had changed it. This is what the judge actually said. It is common ground that if indeed Greenland melted, it would release this amount of water, but only after and over millennia, so that the Armageddon scenario he predicts, insofar as it suggests that sea level rises of 7 meters might occur in the immediate future, is not in line with the scientific consensus. It's interesting to see what Monckton doesn't like in a quote. Monckton always questions whether there's a consensus on climate change, so he changes "not in line with the scientific consensus" to "not based on any scientific view." Now, in his speech and this slide, Monckton does preface this misquote by pointing out the judge was referring to Gore's claim of a 20-foot sea level rise. But that's not always the case. According to an interview with Climate Depot in 2009, Monckton said the judge was referring to Gore's entire movie. And this has inevitably been copied and pasted all over the internet. Now, I'm no fan of Al Gore's film. I've criticised it myself in an earlier video, and I agree with Monckton that it shouldn't be shown in schools. But I didn't need to misrepresent what the judge said in order to rebut Gore's film. I just needed to state the facts.
An appalling admission which was compounded by an admission on the part of the lead author of the subchapter in question that he knew that figure was wrong but had left it in anyway because he knew that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change wanted to influence governments and politicians. So in other words, once again, an admission they were going to lie.
Monckton is referring to Dr. Murari Lal, who wrote the report on Himalayan glaciers for the IPCC. The now famous catalogue of errors began when New Scientist interviewed Syed Hasnain, lead author of a 4-year study by the International Commission on Snow and Ice. According to New Scientist, Hasnain's 4-year study indicates that all the glaciers in the central and eastern Himalayas could disappear by 2035 at their present rate of decline. New Scientist is now calling it a speculative comment, but it wasn't reported as a speculative comment, it was reported as the conclusion of a 4-year study. The Worldwide Fund for Nature picked it up, and Lal, incredible as it may sound, got his information from the WWF. In the Mail on Sunday story, David Rose quoted Lal as saying, "We knew the WWF report with the 2035 date was grey literature," which means material not published in a peer-reviewed journal. But it was never picked up by any of the authors in our working group, nor by any of the more than 500 external reviewers, by the governments to which it was sent, or by the final IPCC review editors. Monckton turned Lal's statement that he knew the 2035 figure wasn't peer-reviewed into an admission by Lal that he knew the figure was wrong. But not even the Mail suggested any such thing. Rose had to set the record straight later by saying he didn't accuse Lal of knowingly publishing false information. This is Monckton's pure invention.
Now, the first chairman of this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was Sir John Horton. And he said, unless we announce disasters, no one will listen. There, from the chairman of the organisation which is supposed to be giving us unprejudiced science on climate change, is a statement that unless we announce disasters, no one will listen. A statement that we are going to reserve the right to ourselves to exaggerate the science so that we can make people listen to us.
Sir John Houghton, whom you see there, the first chairman of the science panel of the IPCC, said, unless we announce disasters, no one will listen.
Monckton's most famous quote has an even more interesting history. He cites a book that Houghton wrote on the subject without saying what it was. But the thing about citing a source is that you actually have to have read the source yourself. For example, I don't have a copy of Houghton's book, so I can't claim the quote isn't in there. But I can cite a story in Britain's independent newspaper saying that the Houghton quote was made up. It traced the quote back to a November 2006 column by Piers Ackerman, writing in Australia's Daily Telegraph, and here it is. Ackerman does give the title of the book, Global Warming, the Complete Briefing, published in 1994. But it's obvious he never read it, and it's obvious Monckton never read it either, because the Independent checked the book and couldn't find the quote anywhere. On February 18th, Ackerman decided that he hadn't got the quote from Houghton's book at all. He'd got it from a Sunday Telegraph article dated September the 10th, 1995. And here it is. And what was the quote? Unless we announce disasters, no one will listen? No. What Houghton actually said was, If we want a good environmental policy in the future, we'll have to have a disaster. And he explained exactly what he meant by that. It's like safety on public transport. The only way humans will act is if there's been an accident. Ackerman explained how that remark came to be slightly paraphrased in the quotation sent to me we shall probably never know. That sort of thing occurs in the blogosphere. Well, duh! Yes, of course it does. That's why all these urban myths you read on the internet can't be trusted. But come on, slightly changed? According to Monckton, the fake Houghton quote means we're going to just make it up so as to scare you until you listen. So if this means the same thing as this, and this means the same thing as this, then quotes aren't really quotes at all. They're just interpretations of what you think someone should have said, and can be changed over and over again. After the Independent story was published, those who had been using the fabricated quote began backtracking, but of course not apologizing or accepting responsibility for their sloppy research. My favourite excuse came from Christopher Booker, another UK Telegraph contributor, who said that he was misled by the internet into assuming the quote was genuine. Yes, damn that internet for confusing me and not letting me check a source properly. But at least Booker agreed to take the fake quote out of his book in the next edition. Monckton simply kept on using it and didn't change a word.
Said, unless we announce disasters, no one will listen, or words to that effect. It came in a Sunday Telegraph article about a dozen years ago. He now tries to deny that he said anything like this, but in fact he did.
No, he didn't. If you now know where this quote came from, and you now accept that it's inaccurate, then you shouldn't keep on using it, however useful it may be in supporting your arguments. You should check the Telegraph story for yourself and tell people what Houghton actually said. In all his previous errors, Monckton at least had the excuse that he's not a scientist and he has no scientific training. So if he misunderstood and misrepresented the papers he was supposedly reading, it comes as no surprise. But here he should know better. Monckton has a diploma in journalism, so he would have learnt that one of the first rules of good journalism is you can't make up quotes, or interpret what someone says, or paraphrase what they say and put quotation marks around it and tell people they said it. Surely that must be obvious even to people with no training in journalism. Apparently not. The most worrying thing about these fabricated quotes is what I discovered in the comments that followed Ackerman's article. Some posters didn't seem to mind at all that they were being fed a fabrication. Pierre's quote is correct. Different words, but the same meaning. Then why change the original? Seems to be an accurate paraphrase to me. But an accurate paraphrase is not the same as a quote, and an inaccurate paraphrase purporting to be a quote is a fabrication. If the words are different but have the same meaning, then why not stick with the words that were actually spoken? The only reason to change the quote, even with a verb tense or a preposition change, is that it does change the meaning. That's why people do it. It's not only downright dishonest and a clear case of fabrication, it's also patronizing. Audiences shouldn't need to have quotes filtered through to them by a process of interpretation and rewording by someone else. You can give your own opinion on a quote, that's fine, or tell people what you think it means, but you can't change it or make it up. We're all capable of hearing a quote uncensored and making up our own minds about what we think it means. This is something Monckton preaches at nearly every presentation.
I'm going to take the approach of Fox News. We report, you decide.
I will give you a covenant that everything I say to you is independently verifiable.
There has been no global warming for a decade.
I'm just going to give it to you straight, for the truth alone is worthy of our entire devotion. And he said, the Armageddon scenario that he depicts is not based on any scientific view.
What I am striving for here is to reach the truth. The objective of science, of economics, and of politics is nothing less than the truth.
An admission on the part of the lead author of the subchapter in question that he knew that figure was wrong.
And before we subjugate the truth to mere expediency, convenience, or profit, it is first desirable to discern the truth. Unless we announce disasters, no one will listen. if you get the science wrong and the policy wrong because you didn't start with the truth, then people end up dead.
You can check, should you wish to do so, that I am not misleading you or pushing you in any political or scientific or economic or moral direction.
I bet my exhausted subscribers will by now be saying, surely there's not still more bunkum to come from Christopher Monckton. Well, afraid so, but I'll cut things short by making this the last debunking video on the error-prone Viscount and just deal with this.
At the moment, the polar ice caps of Mars are melting. There has been warming noticed on the surface of Jupiter, on one of the moons of Neptune, even on far distant Pluto, all at the same time. And why is this? Because astronauts are taking their 4x4s up into space? No, it's because the Sun, as we'll see, has been remarkably active.
The obvious question for skeptics like me to ask is, if it's so obviously the Sun, why do climate scientists say it isn't? Isn't that worth checking? Well, it turns out, as usual, climate scientists know something that Christopher Monckton doesn't. The planets are not all warming, as I pointed out in a previous video. And solar physicists don't measure the output of the Sun by looking at the temperature of the moons of Neptune. We can measure solar irradiance directly and much more accurately from Earth, as Monckton now ably demonstrates.
Now, let's go to this very interesting paper by Sami Solanki. He's one of the most expert solar physicists. He's very balanced. He doesn't take either side in this debate. What he says is the level of solar activity during the past 70 years is exceptional. And the previous period of equally high activity occurred more than 8,000 years ago. We find that during the past 11,400 years, the Sun has spent only of the order of 10% of the time at a similarly high level of magnetic activity, and almost all of the earlier high activity periods were shorter than the present episode. So there is clear evidence that the
Wait, why did you stop reading? That's all Monckton gives his audience, and that's all he shows on his screen. He doesn't show them the actual paper, otherwise they might start reading it for themselves. So let's go back to it and see what Solanki and his fellow researchers say in the very next sentence. Although the rarity of the current episode of high average sunspot numbers may indicate that the Sun has contributed to the unusual climate change during the 20th century, we point out that solar variability is unlikely to have been the dominant cause of strong warming during the past 3 decades. What Solanki found was that with carbon dioxide levels fairly stable, the Sun has been the main driver of climate over the last 11,000 years, as would be expected. And even in the early 20th century, global temperatures correlate very well with varying solar irradiance. If we look at the graph in Solanki's 2003 paper, we can see that global temperatures climbed even higher when solar irradiance climbed to their peak between 1920 and 1950. But since the 1950s, solar irradiance has maintained that high without going any higher. In fact, some researchers say it's even declined slightly, so temperatures should have followed, as they have done for the past 11,000 years. But they don't. Something else is pushing them up. So Solanki's research fits perfectly with what other climate scientists have discovered. For the first time, temperatures are not following the variations of solar activity. Even the charts Monckton uses to try to support his claim that solar activity is causing global temperatures to rise show that cannot be the case. He based this chart on one in this paper by Hathaway and Wilson. Here's the original. It also shows the recent decline in solar activity very clearly based on sunspot numbers. Monckton pressed on with yet another paper he doesn't seem to have read.
But the solar physicists, you might take Scafetta and West, say, in 2008, they attribute 69% of all the recent global warming to the Sun. Most solar physicists agree. The International Astronomical Union in 2004 had a symposium on it. They concluded that that was the case. They said we're now going to get global cooling because the Sun's turned itself off for a bit.
Whoa, there's too much here to deal with in just one hit. Let's debunk this one error at a time.
But the solar physicists, you might take Scafetta and West, say, in 2008, they attribute 69% of all the recent global warming to the Sun.
No, they don't. Scafetter's paper doesn't attribute 69% of warming to the sun at all. It says the sun could account for as much as 69% of warming since 1900.
Most solar physicists agree.
No, they don't. Scafetter and West's maximum figure is at the extreme high end of the range. Most solar physicists put the figure much lower.
The International Astronomical Union in 2004 had a symposium on it. They concluded that that was the case.
Now, this claim was just so extraordinary, you'd have to be a die-hard Monckton groupie not to be sceptical of it. If a major body like the International Astronomical Union had departed from established science in this way, it would be headline news. It would completely undermine a theory that's been at the heart of climate science for over a century. How come I can't find any mention of it except in Monckton's presentations? So I did some digging. I couldn't find a record of the 2004 symposium, either online or at my local university library. Professor John Abraham, who's done a lot of work debunking Monckton, had contacted the Astronomical Union and received a denial of Monckton's claim. But unfortunately, under my own rules, I can't use this as a source. I was going to contact the Astronomical Union myself when someone referred me to a recent TV documentary that spilled the whole thing wide open.
The International Astronomical Union in 2004 had a symposium on it. They concluded that that was the case.
The International Astronomical Union have never agreed this. This argument was put forward by one paper out of 241, submitted to the symposium in 2004.
It didn't represent the view of the whole union, and you said in your talk that it did.
It was a view of the whole union.
The International Astronomical Union in 2004 had a symposium on it. They concluded that that was the case.
There was no such conclusion made.
So there was no such paper.
Which you agreed in an email to this gentleman, Spencer David. He put these accusations to you, and you said, you are right. So you admitted that you had made a mistake. Well,
if what I said gives the impression that this was the view of the entire, and that was the word you used, but I didn't in my speech, IAU, then I'm very happy to make it clear that it wasn't the view of the entire IAU.
Okay, so you made a mistake.
So, if you like, I made a mistake.
No, not if you like. This isn't a matter of opinion. It's just plain wrong, like nearly every other Monckton claim. In fact, I'm not even going to bother debunking what remains of Monckton's claims, because I think by now he's been thoroughly discredited. So how has my Monckton-Bunkum series affected the people whose cause Monckton is trying to champion? Are there any Monckton fans left? Yep, despite clear evidence to the contrary, there are still people who don't think a Viscount, a politician with a classics education from Cambridge, can possibly misunderstand or misrepresent climate science.
Ah, Lord Melbury, do please come this way, your lordship. I have your table over here by the window, as usual.
It is the modus operandus of bought and paid for corporate scum like Potholer54 to search for tiny mistakes in the output of skeptics. They have vast resources. No, you don't need vast resources to check Monckton's claims. All you need is a healthy degree of skepticism. I didn't search for tiny mistakes. I simply checked Monckton's claims, and they turned out to be wrong. Anyone can do the same thing. Watch a Monckton video, look up the sources he cites, and check them. The reason so many Monckton fans don't do this isn't because of a lack of resources, it's because of a lack of skepticism. But Eric has more. Monckton made a mistake. Okay, I magnified one mistake. Monckton made two small mistakes, that's all. Oh, I magnified two small mistakes. Well, I hate to be contrary, as you know. I have a maths-physics degree from a Russell Group university. Okay, that may well be, but let's use that maths degree to do a quick refresher course in counting.
Greetings, it is I, the Count.
Monckton says he advised Margaret Thatcher on climate change. He didn't. He says he wrote a peer-reviewed scientific paper. He didn't. He says the Earth has been cooling. It hasn't. He says Olaf Johannesson found that overall Greenland ice wasn't melting. He didn't. He says there's been no systematic loss of sea ice in the Arctic. There has. He says there's no correlation between temperatures and CO2 over the last 500 million years. There is. He says a Precambrian ice planet shows that CO2 has no effect on climate. Shows the opposite. He says there's been no change in Himalayan glaciers for 200 years. There has. He says only one Himalayan glacier is retreating. No, lots of them are. He quotes a Linson paper to claim that forcing due to CO2 is 1.135 watts per square metre. Linson's paper shows forcing is 3 times higher. He confuses forcing with sensitivity. He says Dr. Pinker's research shows that a loss of cloud cover is responsible for recent warming. She says it shows no such thing. He misquotes Kevin Trenberth, Justice Burton, Murari Lal and Sir John Houghton. He says planets with a high albedo are cooler than planets with a low albedo. Wrong. And in the video you're looking at, we've seen that he got Scafetta's paper wrong and he got Solanke's paper wrong. He says some planets are warming because of the sun. No, they're not. And he said the International Astronomical Union has declared that the sun's responsible for recent warming. It didn't.
Well, how are you, Lord Meldrew? How are you then? All right, mate? How's me old bucker?
I don't have a degree in mathematics from a Russell Group university, but I'd say that's more than a couple of mistakes. And these aren't just minor nitpicked errors, these are the most egregious falsehoods that make up Monckton's entire case against climate science. These are the things Monckton insists the scientists have got wrong.
Why do those who are peddling this threat have to lie?
Stop telling lies. So however many lies are uttered.
But it turns out he's the one that got things wrong, so much so that it would probably be easier to find things he actually got right. So I'll extend that challenge to Monckton fans. Find something that Monckton managed to get right, not the dates of papers or correctly identifying the names of the towns where he was speaking, but something that contradicts climate scientists who conclude that the Earth is warming and that carbon dioxide is largely responsible. But please, before you simply copy and paste a Monckton claim, do something you might never have done before. Check it. If he doesn't give a source, write and ask him for his source. Then check that. You're allowed to cheat, by the way. Check other sites that debunk Monckton's claims, like John Abraham's website and Peter Sinclair's excellent video series on YouTube. And check their sources too. I started this Monckton Bunkum series by asking why people believe him, and after watching hours of Monckton presentations, I can't understand why anybody who's sceptical would believe him. As we've seen, he clearly doesn't know that much basic climatology. He gets his calculations hopelessly wrong, he misunderstands or doesn't properly read most of the scientific papers he quotes, and he continually contradicts himself. But we're not dealing with an audience full of skeptics. We're dealing for the most part with people who are willing to cheer anyone who echoes their own beliefs loudly and confidently enough. Ironically, these people like to call themselves skeptics. Sorry guys, but being a skeptic means you check what you're told. It doesn't mean you believe what someone says simply because he's got a title, or he sounds confident of his facts, or he's good at Latin. So if you want to be a real skeptic, take up my challenge. Check what Monckton says, check his sources, and find something he actually managed to get right. It seems Christopher Monckton has responded to my video series about him, sort of. On the website What's Up With That, he replied not directly to the videos, but to a loose summary of them that someone had posted. What made Monckton's response interesting is that it wasn't really a rebuttal at all, but for the most part an astonishing climb down in his position, and even outright denial of what he said. Once again, this needs very little comment from me because Monckton is extremely good at debunking himself. Just watch. First up, the claim that Monckton was Margaret Thatcher's science advisor. I did advise Margaret Thatcher on many scientific and other matters, including climate change. He may well have done, who knows, but that doesn't make him Margaret Thatcher's science advisor, and that's the claim that's being made by his supporters. I refuted Monckton's claim that he had written a peer-reviewed paper, and he responded, "As was usual for Physics and Society at the time, the journal's review editor, Professor Alvin Saperstein, reviewed the paper. But that's routine editing, Mr. Monckton, which every submission to the newsletter goes through. It's not the same as peer review. Physics and Society itself says it's not a peer-reviewed journal. It's a forum for letters, commentary, book reviews, and non-peer-reviewed articles. Surely anyone who understands scientific publishing knows the difference. So my rebuttal of your claim is correct. What about Monckton's claim that the Earth has been cooling? In 2008 I said the Earth had been cooling since the turn of the millennium on 1st of January 2001. So it had at that time. Do the linear regression for yourself and see. Recent warming, however, means that there's been little change in temperature since 2001. No need to tell us what you said, Mr. Monckton. Here's what you actually said.
And what that looks to me like is a fairly hefty, and indeed it is, statistically significant rate of fall.
But of course, cherry-picking start and end points over such a short period of time is not any kind of guide to long-term temperature change. In statistical parlance, any temperature decline you might have cherry-picked from the graph is not statistically significant. Of course, Monckton claimed that it was.
Statistically significant rate of fall.
But here's someone who contradicts him.
There has been a falling trend in temperatures. It's not at present a statistically significant fall.
Who's the mystery rebutter? Why, it's Monckton himself. This is what I'll call the Monckton manoeuvre, a subtle change in position whenever he gets caught out or realizes he's made a mistake. I'll let the two Monktons argue about whether Monckton's trend is statistically significant or not. As we saw in my video, real climate scientists all agreed that the trend is up, and Monckton can't show where their analysis is wrong. On overall melting of the Greenland ice cap, Johannesson et al., whom I cited, reported a substantial net accumulation of snow, firn and ice on Greenland from 1992 to 2003. As I said, no, he didn't. Here Monckton is simply repeating his claim, even though I showed Johannesson's paper, which Monckton cites, showing the complete opposite to what Monckton claims. How much clearer can that be? But Monckton simply repeats the claim as if repeating it will magically make the paper change its text. But if Monckton ever does get around to realizing his mistake by checking Johannesson's paper more closely, watch out for the next Monckton manoeuvre. My bet is he'll quietly eliminate the word net from his claim. As for no systematic loss of ice in the Arctic, well, before I show Monckton's response to this one, let's just listen again to what he said.
So we're not looking at a sort of long-term systematic loss of ice in the Arctic.
As always, the best person to contradict this claim is Monckton himself. Look for the Monckton manoeuvre buried inside his response. Arctic ice has certainly declined ever since the satellites have been watching. Yes, exactly. So there is a long-term systematic loss of ice in the Arctic, which is exactly what glaciologists and climatologists have been saying, and which Monckton previously denied.
So we're not looking at a sort of long-term systematic loss of ice in the Arctic.
Next, Monckton's claimed that there's no correlation between CO2 and temperatures over the past 500 million years. Monckton responds, there has indeed been a remarkable correlation between CO2 and temperatures over the past 500 million years. What? You've been arguing all along that there was no correlation. Oh, it's another Monckton manoeuvre. So let's just go back to what you told your audiences repeatedly just a couple of years ago.
Here we get a rather prodigious mismatch again between CO2 concentration, which is the black line, and temperature concentration, which is the blue line, going right back to almost 600,000 years into the past. Controversial is that, again, it doesn't show a terribly good link between the two.
And look at how little correlation there is in that graph between temperature in blue there and CO2 concentration in black.
Now Monckton quietly drops that claim altogether and brazenly tells us the complete opposite. Next, a pre-Cambrian ice planet shows that CO2 has no effect on the climate. Okay, Monckton goes into a rather long and boring dissertation on this, but here's the main point. The reasonable point that I made, quoting Professor Ian Plimer, a geologist who has made a particular study of the period, was that even allowing for the fact that the sun was 5% fainter in the Neo-Proterozoic than today, and for the fact that the planet's albedo was much greater than now, equatorial sea level glaciers could not have come and gone twice if CO2 had had the very large warming effect that is now imagined. Monckton ignores real research, which I cited, showing that carbon dioxide played a crucial role in unlocking the Earth from a global glaciation. The question I asked in my video was, if the Earth was effectively deep frozen with glaciers at the equator and a much weaker sun, as Monckton agrees, and a high albedo that reflected most of the solar energy it did receive, how did the Earth emerge from this condition and turn into a hothouse, not just once, but perhaps 2 or 3 times? Monckton doesn't even try to answer this question. He simply repeats his belief that CO2 could not have unfrozen the Earth, but he gives no explanation for that belief. He says there's been no change in Himalayan glaciers for 200 years. There has. Let's just see where this claim comes from.
They're doing fine, by the way. He's got 200 years of records from the days of the Raj, when we first began monitoring these things, don't you know? And the glaciers are showing no particular change in 200 years. The only glacier that's declined a little is Gangotri, very famous glacier, because there's been local geological instability, nothing to do with global warming. All the others are doing fine.
Well, in the rebuttal, Monckton says something slightly different. The pattern of advance and retreat of the glaciers is as much as it has been over the past 200 years since the Raj first kept records. But that's not what Monckton told his audiences. He told them only one glacier had retreated a little. Astonishingly, Monckton has already done one Monckton manoeuvre on this when I questioned him about his sources, and he came up with the fact that Himalayan glaciers have been receding since the 19th century. Which of the three versions do you want to believe? Well, I'm not inclined to believe any of them, because this isn't a matter of belief, but of properly conducted studies, and nowhere does Monckton cite a single study except reference to his exchanges with Professor Batt, the man he claims is responsible for monitoring Himalayan glaciers. But Monckton doesn't rebut my revelation that Batt is not the person responsible for monitoring Himalayan glaciers. How do I know? Because Batt himself says so. What's Monckton's answer to this? None at all. And that takes us very neatly on to the next claim, which was that only one Himalayan glacier was retreating. Of course, now there's a Monckton manoeuvre on this. He now goes on to admit that many other glaciers are receding. And he says, merely because I mentioned one glacier as receding, it is not legitimate to infer that I said or implied that only one glacier was receding.
The only glacier that's declined a little is Gangotri.
But I'm not inferring it, Mr. Monckton. You said it quite clearly.
The only glacier that's declined a little is Gangotri.
If you can't even stand by your original claim, but exercise another slippery Monckton manoeuvre to deny you ever said it, then I guess the first Mr. Monckton was wrong, and my rebuttal of him is correct. Now Monckton's claim that CO2 forcing is 1.135 watts per square metre. Here's his response. A finding of low climate sensitivity in Linson suggests that the warming exercised by CO2 is equivalent to assuming a forcing of 1.135 watts per square metre. Again, never mind what you think you said or what you meant to say, Mr. Monckton. Here's what you actually wrote in your APS opinion piece. Forcing approximately equals 1.135 watts per square metre. I know, let's make it go away for a second and see if it changes into something else. Nope, he really did write that. And to substantiate the rest of my statement, climatologists, even the skeptics, all agree that the figure is in fact around 3 times higher. Even Linson, whose paper Monckton cites, puts the figure 3 times higher. So I don't know what else I have to do to show that my claim is correct. Now, of course, various factors might make it appear that forcing is less, but that's called sensitivity, which is something completely different. And that brings us on to the next Monckton error, that he confused forcing with sensitivity. I gave an explanation of forcing and sensitivity in one of my Monckton bunkum videos. If you open all the windows on a cold night, it might appear that the output of a heater has been reduced, but that's an illusion. The heater's still pumping out the same amount of heat. It's how the house responds to that heat source that decides the ultimate temperature. It's summed up in this very well-known equation. If Monckton for some reason thinks the Earth is not responding to a CO2 increase in the way most climatologists conclude, what he should have done is reduce sensitivity by 3. Nowhere in his What's Up with That response does Monckton deny he mixed the two up. He just makes the most astonishing excuse for it, which is that it doesn't matter which you divide by 3, it comes out to the same answer anyway. But even this excuse is belied by Monckton's belated attempts to cover up his mistake. In his opinion piece for the APS newsletter, he tells us quite clearly he divided forcing by 3. But later he obviously realized his mistake, and in a response to critics tried to pretend he'd divided sensitivity by 3. This quiet reversal of position is the closest you'll ever get to an admission from Monckton that he made a mistake. He says a leading climate researcher found a loss of cloud cover is responsible for recent warming. She says it shows no such thing. Actually, what I showed in my video were 3 instances of Monckton citing a paper by Rachel Pinker and claiming that it demonstrated decreased cloud cover was responsible for recent warming. And I showed a statement from Dr. Pinker explaining that her paper didn't demonstrate this at all and that Monckton was wrong. What's Monckton's rebuttal? OK, there is a bit of a Monckton manoeuvre here. He no longer asserts that warming is due to decreased cloud cover, it's now just a hypothesis, and it doesn't come from Dr. Pinker or the paper, it comes from Monckton's interpretation of her paper. So who's right? Now, before anyone starts thinking that maybe Dr. Pinker, despite 30 years as a researcher, is not very bright and might have made a mistake, let me just get a character reference from someone who may be familiar to you.
He is wholly unconcerned with the global warming debate. It's as though he lives on another planet. He lives for verifying whether satellites are doing their job. That's what Pinker is all about.
Then my rebuttal of his claim obviously stands. Dr. Pinker does indeed say that Monckton is wrong. Now, I never said Monckton misquoted scientists to mislead his audience, but I did show how he changed quotes in order to support his arguments. Monckton responds, "No instances are given to support this libel, so I cannot comment." But of course instances are given very clearly. What you'll read next are the actual quotes, and what you'll hear are Mr. Monckton's misquotes.
There has been no global warming for a decade. We cannot explain why. It is a travesty that we can't.
And he said, the Armageddon scenario that he depicts is not based on any scientific view.
Unless we announce disasters, no one will listen.
If Mr. Monckton thinks I'm being libelous by showing him publicly giving altered versions of these quotes, great, sue me, and I'll be happy to produce all of this evidence in court. Monckton said planets with a high albedo are cooler than planets with a low albedo. Now, Monckton starts off his response with the carefully chosen words, if all other parameters be held constant. Now, this is correct, but Monckton didn't tell his audiences that. He didn't tell them that in order to make this conclusion, one has to strip away a planet's atmosphere. So a planet with an atmosphere is going to behave completely differently, and our planet does have an atmosphere. So what he told the audience was wrong. And by using the Monckton manoeuvre to add the unassuming phrase, if all other parameters be held constant, Monckton accepts that what he said was wrong. Monckton gets information in peer-reviewed science papers wrong. And he responds, not a single instance is cited. This is pure yaboo. Of course an instance is cited, Mr. Monckton. Several instances are cited. I cited your misquote of a paper by Scafetta and West. And of course I cited Johannesson and a paper by Sami Solanki et al. He says some planets are warming because of the sun. No, they're not. Again, I didn't write this, someone put this on the forum, and it isn't really even a paraphrase of what I said, but Monckton's response is interesting anyway. There has indeed been evidence of simultaneous warming in many planets of the solar system, and I have mentioned this. Well, that's true. However, given the difficulties of reliable measurement and imaging, I have not sought to draw definitive conclusions about the role of the sun in global warming from such observations. Really?
At the moment, the polar ice caps of Mars are melting. There has been warming noticed on the surface of Jupiter, on one of the moons of Neptune, even on far distant Pluto, all at the same time. And why is this? Because astronauts are taking their 4x4s up into space? No, it's because the sun, as we'll see, has been remarkably active.
I can't add to this except to say another Monckton manoeuvre. Monckton is now completely denying something he said in front of audiences and even filmed for distribution. He said that the International Astronomical Union has declared the sun is responsible for the recent warming. It didn't. And Monckton responds, I cited a paper given by Dr. Habibullah Abdusamatov at the 2004 symposium of the IAU in St. Petersburg, Florida, but put IAU at the foot of the slide rather than Dr. Abdusamatov's name. Well, I'd say that was a mistake because Dr. Abdusamatov is clearly not the International Astronomical Union. And Monckton seems to make a habit of replacing the name Dr. Abdusamatov for the International Astronomical Union. Now, to slip up on a name once is perhaps understandable. To continue to do it is astonishing.
Most solar physicists agree. The International Astronomical Union in 2004 had a symposium on it. They concluded that that was the case.
And this is not my conclusion. This is the conclusion of the International Astronomical Union symposium in 2004. This is what they said. The sun caused today's warming. Today's warming is normal.
Well, that covers all the responses. I'll have to put my conclusions in the second part of this video. In the first part of this two-part video, I went through Monckton's responses to my catalogue of his errors, and I'd like to just see how the mistake count now stands. First, the easy ones. Here Monckton does a U-turn and either denies he said something or completely changes his mind, mostly to the point of agreeing with my rebuttal.
So we're not looking at a sort of long-term systematic loss of ice in the Arctic. And look at how little correlation there is in that graph between temperature in blue there and CO2 concentration in black. And the glaciers are showing no particular change in 200 years. The only glacier that's declined a little is Gangotri. The only glacier that's declined a little is Gangotri. At the moment, the polar ice caps of Mars are melting. There has been warming noticed on the surface of Jupiter, on one of the moons of Neptune, even on far distant Pluto, all at the same time. And why is this? Because astronauts are taking their 4x4s up into space? No. It's because the sun, as we'll see, has been remarkably active.
Of course, don't expect Monckton to admit he made a mistake. What he does in these U-turns is add some new claim in the hopes that a debate over the new claim will bury his mistake. So his admission that there is a correlation between CO2 and global temperatures is accompanied by a new and unsupported claim that the data shows it was the temperature rise that came first. If ever Mr. Monckton gets around to providing a source for this claim, citing studies where the repeated analysis of this data covering the Phanerozoic was published, then I'll be happy to check it. But first you have to reconcile your claim that there's no correlation between CO2 and temperatures with your new claim that there is. Which one is correct? Or are you now prepared to accept that you were wrong and that my rebuttal was therefore right? You can't continue to argue two completely contradictory beliefs. Similarly, the admission that there's been a 30-year decline in Arctic ice is buried within a claim about the state of the ice in the 1920s and 40s. I'm quite prepared to tackle this one with the help of Ole Johannessen, a very diligent Danish researcher who compiled this graph covering exactly the period Monckton cites. By the way, if Monckton wants to suggest that maybe Johannessen is not a diligent researcher and faked this data as part of a worldwide conspiracy, let me bring in a character witness. You know who it's going to be, don't you? You're right.
Johannessen et al., very diligent Danish researcher.
But again, before we go on to this claim, Monckton first needs to fess up and tell us whether he's sticking to what he told his audiences, which is that we're not looking at a sort of long-term decline of ice in the Arctic, or whether Arctic ice has certainly declined over the last 3 decades, which is what he told us in What's Up With That. In an apology to Monckton, who had asked that such criticism should be blocked, the moderator for What's Up With That claimed my rebuttals lack any form of documentation. I don't know just what sort of documentation What's Up With That would like to see. How about a paper that Monckton cites claiming it says one thing, with big red lines underneath the relevant passage showing it says the complete opposite? How about court transcripts and newspaper articles showing actual quotes and comparing them to Monckton's rendering of the quotes? How about a video showing Monckton actually saying something that he denies saying? How about this long list of documents, including title, author and date, along with the time on the video where the document is cited in rebuttal to Monckton? But no, sycophancy wins over science. I'm a personal admirer of yours, and regret any distress such comments may occasion. Yes, don't upset the Viscount by informing him that these documents say something very different to what he's telling us they say. Far better to pretend they simply don't exist. I never claim Monckton said or wrote something without having a video of him or a document written by him stating it, and I never refute anything without backing it up with documentary evidence, even showing you exactly where to find the evidence in the document. I don't think I could do much more without tying the editors of What's Up With That to a chair and forcing them to look at it. Everything is meticulously researched and then checked to ensure it's accurate, and I always correct any errors that are found, either with an annotation or in an errata video. I have a completely open forum for every video on my channel where people can criticize me or the videos to their heart's content. These policies are ones that What's Up With That might like to follow, instead of apologizing to Monckton for a critique and making the absurd claim that there's no documentation to back it up. It's no excuse to say this comment about a lack of documentation was directed towards the other Brian, the poster, because he clearly stated that he was summarizing my rebuttals on the forum, and he gave my YouTube name. Someone even posted URLs linked to my videos. So my rebuttals could easily have been checked, as well as the documentation supporting them. Even the editor, Anthony Watt, seems completely disinterested in checking any documents that might contradict Monckton. The best choice in dealing with such individuals is to take their claims head-on, he tells Monckton, which you've done. Oh, come on. He hasn't taken these claims head-on. He's either ignored the documentary evidence, as you have, or denied he said something, or simply changed his claim to conform to the rebuttal. But of course Monckton is a revered figure among critics of climate science and a frequent commentator on What's Up With That, whereas I'm just running this little pony and trap show on YouTube, meticulously documenting evidence that Mr. Monckton and his friends at What's Up With That feel quite happy to ignore. Dear Mr. Monckton, a couple of months ago you entered into a debate with me on What's Up With That about alleged errors in your public lectures, allegations that I made in a series of videos on my YouTube channel Potholer54. But as soon as I presented documentary evidence to back up my claims, you suddenly fell silent. Despite promising Anthony Watts that you'd respond when you returned from Australia mid-February, you haven't done so, and now you've written to tell me that you are, in effect, running away. Sorry, I don't know how else to phrase your abrupt retreat from our debate. I'm referring to your email to me dated March 22nd. I'm on a very busy tour and will be more busy when I return to the UK, so I don't know when I shall have further time to respond. Many people like to engage in debates on inconsequentialities, and while I try to accommodate them, other priorities must sometimes come first. Let me address the first excuse first. I understand you're currently on a busy tour, but you promised Anthony Watts you would respond when you returned from your last tour, and you did not. Meanwhile, I note that you have had plenty of time to respond to a university newsletter that criticised you, and you spent 2 hours talking on Skype to a small classroom of students. I fail to see why these are priorities, while my 57,000 subscribers and the hundreds of thousands of subscribers to What's Up With That are not deserving of an answer from you concerning clear evidence that you seriously misled your audiences over a period of several years. The people watching this debate have watched you vacate your chair and are still expecting to see you reappear from backstage at any moment with some incisive rebuttal after checking my evidence. I'm sure they'll be as shocked as I am to hear the squealing of car tires as you make good your escape. You have, after all, been given every advantage in this debate. It's taking place on What's Up With That, a regular forum for you and one that you chose, so there can be no suggestion that the umpire is biased against you. In fact, even though he and I disagree on the climate issue, Anthony Watts has been good enough to give us equal space for our responses. You were given 2 opportunities to rebut my videos, responding first to a summary of them that was made by someone in a What's Up With That comments forum, and then directly to something that was, as you put it, not word for word what Peter Hadfield said, but I hope they fairly convey his meaning. With respect, no, the points you wrote did not fairly convey my meaning. In fact, they ignored the substance of the allegations altogether, and a lot of your response focused on ad hominem attacks questioning my integrity, honesty, and intelligence. So when I responded with the actual allegations, along with supporting documentary evidence, 17 video clips of your speeches, 13 scientific papers and studies, and 1 newspaper article that you yourself cited, and showed that you had clearly misquoted or misrepresented your own sources, you inexplicably fell silent and then failed to deliver your promised response. If you'd like to argue that these allegations have already been answered elsewhere, then simply copy and paste the answers you've already given. I submit that you have not answered these allegations anywhere, and one reason I know that is because I had to email you to ascertain some of your sources, something very few people have done. Now you can prove me wrong very easily by pasting the answers into your response. If you want to publicly thrash me in this debate and show that I'm wrong, then the intelligent and mature way to do this is to show it with evidence. Many people like to engage in debates on inconsequentialities. If you think these issues are inconsequentialities, then why did you bring them up time and time again during your many public speeches? The sun is largely responsible for recent warming. There's no correlation between CO2 and temperature over the last 500 million years. Only one Himalayan glacier is retreating. The Earth has been cooling. Greenland isn't melting. There's no long-term decline of Arctic ice, etc., etc. It was you, not I, who decided these should be the bedrock of your case against anthropogenic climate change. I simply emailed you to ask for the sources of your assertions, and when you gave them to me, I checked them. And it turned out that you either misrepresented or misquoted these sources, or your source doesn't have the authority you claim it does. And if you think they're inconsequentialities, why did you decide to expend several thousand words on what's up with that, trying to rebut them? You were quite happy to do so when you thought the debate would be easy, and you thought these were just vague allegations. It was only when I came back with details and a wealth of supporting evidence that you apparently decided it was better to beat a hasty retreat than try to answer such prima facie evidence. I appreciate that you'd much prefer this kind of debate take place on stage, where oratory is paramount. It's much harder to engage in this kind of debate online, where everything is written down and can be quoted back, where sources are demanded for any facts you give, and where these sources can be checked and verified. But this is the nub of our debate, whether you've chosen reliable sources and quoted and represented them correctly. Nowhere in my videos or in the What's Up with that debate have I suggested you're making these errors deliberately or that you're being dishonest, a courtesy you didn't extend to me, and neither have I descended to ad hominem attacks or name-calling, also a courtesy you didn't extend to me. Errors are simply errors in my book, and if you unintentionally misled your audiences over several years, then I accept that it was unintentional. After all, the truth alone is worthy of our entire devotion, as you yourself said at the Frontier Center for Public Policy last year.
The truth alone is worthy of our entire devotion.
In the same speech you said, before we subjugate the truth to mere expediency, convenience or profit, it's first desirable to discern the truth.
And before we subjugate the truth to mere expediency, convenience or profit, it is first desirable to discern the truth.
And again, what matters here are the facts. What matters here is the truth.
And what matters here are the facts. What matters here is the truth.
For a man so dedicated to the truth, I'm surprised that you didn't jump at the opportunity to either rebut my allegations by showing that it's I, not you, who misread these sources and quotes, or check your sources again and acknowledge that you made these errors. In that spirit, I urge you to rejoin the debate that Anthony Watts has so kindly agreed to host. This may be a triumph of hope over experience. My experience tells me you won't be too busy to issue a long response addressing the issue of the debate itself and why you shouldn't have to continue it, or an attempt to deflect the debate onto some other subject or forum, combined with another ad hominem attack on me. Instead of what everyone would like to see, which is either a clear rebuttal or acceptance of the evidence I provided.